Hello, friends. Welcome to the Tell It Like It Is podcast. I'm your host, Alexi Bailey, and I have Jacob Dlamini. Thank you so much for joining us, Jacob. I appreciate you taking the time. I know it's a complicated time, among all the things going on and the complexities of the virus and the busy schedule. Classes back in session. I appreciate your work.
Okay.
And I know you from the community, and we value community, in person connection, and all of these complicated things. And I reached out to you specifically because I saw your article in the Princeton Journal. And I think the larger conversation is, how do we make life better? How do we heal? How do we move forward? Get towards wholeness. It's a long journey, but we have work to do today that we all should be doing. So I know that you use your work, your career, to do that. How do you feel like it's going, or what do you?
Well, Alexi, I should start by saying thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me, to welcome me to your podcast. I really appreciate that. So I think the best way to answer your question is to say that as a historian, I think one way, and it's not the only way, I think one way to aspire towards wholeness, I think one way to work towards healing, because it's a process, right? It never is a complete thing, is to ask what are hopefully the right questions, to look to history and to try and understand what happened in the past, and to see what the connections might be between what happened in the past and what's happening now, in hopes that in looking to the past, we will learn lessons that we're going to take with us into the future. And so that's how I see my work. I see my work as asking questions that are not always asked, looking at topics that are not always looked at, and using that to try and come to a better understanding of the past and its connection to the present and the future.
What kind of connections have you made so far?
Well, I think the most obvious connection that I've made in my work, and I should say that my work is specifically on South Africa right now, and the connection that I've made is that there's a lot of trauma in South Africa, what we might call historical trauma, and that the only way to make sense of this trauma is to look to the past, to see how developments, ideas, events from the past, have come to shape the ways in which people live in the present. The connections I've made, at the level of politics, have to do with things like accountability. So why is it that in South Africa, and this actually applies to other places too, the police as an agent, as an agency, as an institution, are so averse, I can't think of a better word, so averse to accountability. Right? And I think an important explanation for this in the South African context is that to understand why the police in South Africa are not accountable, you have to go back to the past to see how they operated in the past, operated with impunity, did things just because they could do them, and got away with them, and have been historically resistant to accountability. Right? Because historically, the police in South Africa saw themselves, and in some ways they still see themselves today, as an outside force there to enforce law and order, not as a community agency, not as a body that is there to protect the people. Right? And so these are some of the connections that I've made. They don't, apply immediately to other cases, I'm sure, but there are in some places parallels that are very obvious.
So much of the brokenness that we experience, it's parallel, across the globe, for sure. And a lot of the things that happened, they didn't happen in a bubble. They were happening in multiple places and these kinds of things. And, South Africa, we know, has a long history. And I know that there, would you say there's been progress?
I think the best way to answer your question, and it's an important question, is it depends on what you're looking at.
Right.
Has there been progress when it comes to, say, reducing poverty? Yes, there has been progress. There's less poverty than there was under apartheid. Has there been progress in reducing income inequality? No. In fact, there's more income inequality now than there was under apartheid. What about the gap between rich and poor? That gap has widened. What about the gap between black rich and black poor? That gap is much bigger than it's ever been. So it all depends on what you look at. In some places, yes, there is progress, but in many other places, no, there is. And in fact, in many other places, there's actually regression. And this is important. And of course, this makes people uncomfortable.
Right.
Right? Because we want the story of South Africa to be the story of redemption, the story of hope, the story of Mandela, Desmond Tutu, the Rainbow Nation, but it doesn't always work out that way.
I have to say that, looking at your work, you're very brave. And you're doing we need people to say the unpopular things.
That's true.
And it's very easy for us to have a large majority saying, oh, this is what's happening and it's great. And you're like, well, that's not really what's happening, And there's a certain level of bravery to make that statement and to hold that argument and to be that beacon on the hill to say, this is, we're saying one thing and we're doing another.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. You're right. In some ways, I wouldn't describe myself as brave. I think what defines my approach is with interest. I'm interested. So why are these stories not being told?
Right.
Why are these connections not being made? That's the approach I take. I try and do stuff that people aren't doing, not because they don't know about it, because they're just not interested.
Right.
Yeah, and I am interested. So that is the approach that defines my work. This attempt to understand why things are complex. Right? Because I know that things are complex, and also know that I think a lot of people will just leave it at that. Other things are complicated.
Right.
Why are they complicated? What does a complication mean? And how do you make sense of it? How do you make sense of it in ways that allow us to make better sense of the present? And so that's the approach. I'm reluctant to come as a brave. I appreciate it. I'm just eager. I'm just interested. I'm just cool.
Similarly, so I have an interest in looking at asking the questions and getting answers about A, in America, and B, there's the colonial period, we're still healing from that. And all of these colonial ills that are still going on, a lot of people don't really understand that. So there's a huge parallel between the work you're doing and the work that still needs to be done in America and across the globe. Who came in? Who was the culprit for what happened in South?
That's Alexia. That's an interesting question, right? How do you think about who the culprits are, who the victims are? What does it mean for how we think about complexity, complicity? Reparations that we would have been bring to the table too. And I think the answer, and it's not the only answer, sure, but I think the answer for some of that it's not so easy to say who the culprits are. And I know the tendency is just to look at it through a racial lens and say, well, white folks are the culprits, black folks are the victims. When actually things are messier than that. It's not that simple. Race is not always this divider, it's not always this neat line that helps us see who's white and who's black. So it's a complicated question, and I think for us to offer any meaningful answers to who the culprit is, we have to look to the specifics, right? So what are we talking about? What time period? Which part of the world are we looking at? Which part of South Africa are we looking at? Which groups of people are we studying? And what are the motivations? What is the dispute? If there's a dispute about, and how do they try and resolve it? How do they try and fight it out? So there's never one answer. I think it's sort of a lot of different answers that are always context specific. Right? Because context is key.
Right.
To any attempt to understand what's going on, what happened, or what might happen in the future.
When the colonizers came, they were locals who were complicit.
Well, I don't know if complicit is the word, right? But certainly, I mean, I always say this to my students, right? That if you think about colonialism in Africa, you think about white supremacy. You don't want to make the mistake of assuming like just a group of white men just came and took over, just like that. But there was a lot of local support for some of what they did. That there are a lot of local people who supported them for whatever reason, and that we actually need to tell these stories. We need to appreciate what this means.
The complexity.
Yeah. So, for example, when the British finally destroyed the Zulu kingdom in 1789. In fact, there's many Zulus fighting on the British side as they are fighting on the Zulu side. And that for me is a much more interesting story because it raises the obvious question, wow, why would there be so many Zulus fighting with the British against other so-called Zulu people? And you can only understand that if you take seriously the fact that people come to their decisions, with different motivations, different histories, different ideas about what it means to be Zulu, or what it means to be non-Zulu. And it's very easy for us to sit here and just look back and say, well, actually, these guys were collaborators, those were not. When in that moment, right, it wasn't always clear who was doing the right thing and who wasn't.
I think that's an important point, and I think complexity is what we're going to take away from this today. There's so many complexities that remain today, and I feel like as time goes on, the complexities are increasing.
Right.
With interracial things and money being mixed and the different factions and all of these complexities, it's piling up.
Yeah. In some ways, I think complexity is what defines us, as a species, as humans. But also complexity, I think, is what defines, human relations. I think there's always complexity, right? The challenge is to, in some ways, understand it if we can, and then go beyond it, right? And then ask the question. So if we say, well, this is complex, why does it matter? Okay? What's the significance?
Right.
And that is something harder to do than just saying, well, things are complex. Of course, things are always complex.
Remind me of the title, Native.
Well, so the one is on native nostalgia.
Right.
Yeah.
And that one has Nelson Mandela on the cover.
Well, actually, no, so the one that has Nelson Mandela on the cover is called Safari Nation.
Safari Nation.
So that one is actually about conservation.
Right.
It's about the relationship between Black people and conservation.
So we're talking about complexity, right? I'm sure in that moment, Nelson Mandela may have been, with this guy and he doesn't support, poaching and all of these things. And I think that cover was speaking to that, right?
Well, so actually, I like the cover because it speaks to, for me, it speaks to something different, right? It speaks to the idea of Mandela with a gun, right? Because it's not an image that you're familiar with.
Right.
So Mandela with a gun, Mandela shooting and killing things. That's not an image that you're familiar with, right? Because people prefer to think of Mandela as this doting grandfather, this loving grandfather, this man of peace. So when he wasn't always that.
Right. That's the complexity that I like.
Yeah. So this is an important part of it. That there's a different dimension to Mandela, and for us to appreciate him in his fullness, we have to come to terms with the fact that Mandela did carry guns, that Mandela did think of using guns, and that in that particular instance, yes, he does use it to kill, the buck, right? And so that's what that demon speaks to this complexity, the multi-dimensional nature of character. Right? That we never are just one thing. We are not just fathers. We are brothers. We are siblings.
Right.
We uncles.
Children.
We're children. Yeah. Oh, most important of all, right?
Right.
And so, for someone to appreciate you, Alexi, for someone to appreciate me, right, they have to take us all, in our fullness, right?
I think our culture and our generation, we that's a big problem now.
Yeah.
We see things one-dimensionally.
That's right.
And I mean, I know it's not a new phenomenon, but I think it's getting more and more common, and it becomes a thing, when you see someone like Martin Luther King came to mind. And we have this image of Martin Luther King, and he was just a regular person.
And that's a waste. Yeah, with regular weaknesses,
Right.
Regular strengths. I mean, he was exceptional.
Right.
And that's always, he was exceptional. That's how we all know about it.
Right.
And he fought a good fight, right? But he also had these regular flaws, right? He also had these weaknesses. Right? And I think that's part of what makes it so interesting, right? That, he wasn't this angel, he wasn't pure, he wasn't perfect, right? But he fought a good fight, right? Yeah.
Yes. So we definitely have to plan some more.
That's it's been great. Yeah, and then let's do some more. And in fact, it's like have a nice long conversation about fatherhood.
Absolutely.
About,
A lot of what the podcast is doing, right?
Yeah.
It's not about South Africa or America, right?
Yeah.
I'm very passionate about the whole picture.
Yeah.
And I don't think you can have a solution in one place that's, it has to be across the board. And so much of what we've experienced it came across the board. It wasn't just one place, right? And like I said, healing, that's what's important to me, And as fathers, we're trying to push that into the next generation, teach our kids that. And how do you teach them, how to navigate complexity, be whole, promote healing, and not get sucked into the wrong things.
Oh, absolutely.
So all of these things, how do you teach this to a 4-year-old? You're teaching them basic morals, but you're also teaching them to be good to strangers and not to see race and categorize people and like all of these complexities. You have to teach them to children. So this podcast is about talking about complexity.
Nice.
It's not just tell me about South Africa or tell me about your work.
No, and that's great. And I appreciate it. Yeah. So let's do that. I think next time maybe use fatherhood as a pivot or
absolutely.
Community would be another one.
Yes.
I think faith would be another one. Yeah.
All of these things. All of these are elements of our wholeness that we have to process. And I'm all about it because it's a complex time, and I think we can do a lot more to heal. We can make bigger strides. We are making strides, but I think the individual. Hey, let's have lunch. Bigger strides. Hey, your kid and my kid's in the same class. Come on over for dinner. Let's make strides and let's be honest. And you have to be vulnerable, and you have to put yourself out there. And some people are going to be hesitant just because of they're not used to that. So there's a real work here, and that's what I'm doing with the podcast.
That's awesome. Thank you so much.
It's complicated and it's a big thing, and I want it to be contagious. So that's the whole point of having it recorded, right? If I can say to someone, hey, lend me some of your time, so a lot of people are afraid to be on a podcast. Like, what are we going to say? And be vulnerable enough and just say what you feel about the difficulty, because being in Princeton, we are role models for the future,
That's
but there's still difficulty. There's still this level of hesitancy, just people just staying in boxes. So I want to talk about that. Why are we doing that? And when you try not to do that, how is that for you? So it's a giant ball, and I'm really just whatever piece you can, fatherhood, faith, community, because I'm living it and I want to be impactful. It doesn't have to be something that, you know, Johannesburg hears about, but I want that 5 years from now, you can say, hey, me and Alexi, we formed a deeper relationship.
And we had these conversations.
Right. And it led to dinner, we had community, and it led to something bigger that you can say, my children saw me participating in something that was meaningful. And that's it, man.
That's great. Thank you so much.
I appreciate your time today.
That's it. We'll have another time.
We'll do it again.
That's awesome.
Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
That's awesome.